It began with a children's hockey practice. The scrape of skates against ice, the crack of sticks against the boards. Parents watching from the stands as an ordinary summer afternoon unfolded. And then one father decided the game had become too rough. Words were exchanged, tempers rose. And near the locker rooms, two men began to fight. Bystanders separated them. One of the fathers walked away, and it should have ended there. But minutes later, he returned. What happened next unfolded in front of nearly a dozen children, including the sons of both men. One of the fathers was knocked to the floor, the other positioned himself on top of him. And then the punches. Witnesses begged him to stop. You're going to kill him. By the time bystanders pulled him away, the father beneath him was no longer moving. He would never regain consciousness. The killing would become national news, a symbol of parental rage and the pressures surrounding youth sports. But the headlines told only part of the story. Behind it were two fathers with complicated histories, children forced to witness an unimaginable act of violence, and two families whose lives would remain connected long after the cameras disappeared. To understand how a children's hockey practice reached that point, we have to begin with the place where it happened, and with a sport that is deeply embedded in the identity of the region. This is the Hockey Dad murder. In Massachusetts, history lives on every street corner, in every town center, in every quiet neighborhood. You think you know, but behind some of those places are stories that never really left. Stories of people, families, and moments that have changed entire communities forever. This is Murders in Massachusetts. I'm Jonathan Power, creator, executive producer, and host. Each episode will take a closer look at real cases across the Bay State. Not just what happened, but where it happened, and how it continues to shape the people and places left behind. Because these aren't just headlines, they're part of the towns we call home. And if you find these stories meaningful, be sure to follow the podcast so you always know when new episodes are available. This podcast discusses real crimes, including murder, and in some cases, crimes involving children. These topics may be disturbing for some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. In Greater Boston, hockey is not merely entertainment. It's part of the culture, passed from parents to children in professional arenas, university rivalries, and neighborhood ice rinks. The Boston Bruins have occupied a central place in that culture since 1924, when they became the first American-based franchise in the National Hockey League. As one of the NHL's original 6 teams, the Bruins developed a reputation for toughness, particularly during the era of Big Bad Bruins, led by players such as Bobby Orr and Phil Esposito. College hockey inspires an equally intense loyalty. Every February, Boston University, Boston College, Northeastern, and Harvard compete in the Beanpot, a tournament shaped by school pride, historic rivalries, and local bragging rights. But Boston's hockey culture does not truly begin at the professional or collegiate level. It begins with the children learning to balance on skates, parents carrying heavy equipment through frozen parking lots, and families spending countless early mornings on cold metal benches. In these communities, hockey can become more than a sport. It can represent family tradition, sacrifice, pride, and toughness. That passion extends through the suburbs surrounding Boston, and one of those communities is Reading, Massachusetts. Located approximately 12 miles north of Boston, Reading combines the appearance of a traditional New England town with the prosperity of the greater Boston metropolitan area. Its neighborhoods are home to corporate executives, technology and biotech professionals, healthcare administrators, and other white collar workers who commute into Boston or along the Route 128 corridor. Living beside them is a deeply established working class: contractors, electricians, plumbers, union employees, and independent tradespeople whose families often have long-standing connections to the community. It is the kind of town where a corporate lawyer and an electric contractor might live on the same street and send their children to the same schools and spend their weekends together at the same youth sports events. Today, Reading is an affluent community with high household incomes, expensive homes, and a large percentage of college-educated residents. But beneath those statistics is a town whose identity remains centered on families, school, civil involvement, and youth athletics. Although the financial landscape has changed since the summer of 2000, that family-centered culture was already well established. Local fields, skating rinks were not simply recreational facilities, they were gathering places, part of the social fabric of the town. The Burbank Ice Arena was one of those places. On July 5, 2000, it began the setting for a confrontation that would force the country to examine the darker side of parental involvement in youth sports. The afternoon began with an informal hockey session known as stick practice. Among the parents arriving at the arena was Reading resident Thomas Junta, a 44-year-old truck driver. With him were his 10-year-old son, Quinlan, and two of Quinlan's friends. Michael Costin, a 40-year-old resident from neighboring Linfield, was also at the rink. He had brought three of his sons and was supervising what was intended to be a non-contact scrimmage. The two fathers came from complicated personal backgrounds. Junta was a husband and father whose defense attorney would later describe him as a gentle giant. Costin was a single father raising four children, three sons and a daughter. Earlier in his life, Costin had accumulated a lengthy criminal record and spent some time in a psychiatric facility. According to his family and friends, however, he had worked to move beyond those struggles and rebuild his life. Only 6 months before the hockey practice, he had successfully obtained custody of his children. Those close to Costin said fatherhood had become the center of his life. On that July afternoon, 3 of the children he had fought to bring home were with him at the rink. At first, the practice appeared ordinary. Children moved across the ice while parents watched from the stands. But as the session continued, Junta became concerned about the level of physical contact. He later said he saw players slashing and checking during what was supposed to be a non-contact scrimmage. According to Junta, another player elbowed Quinlan, his son, in the face. To Junta, the children's safety was being ignored. He left the stands and approached Costin, who was supervising the session. Junta complained that the play had become too aggressive and accused Costin of failing to control it. Costin did not share his concern. His response was brief. He reportedly responded, "That's hockey." But it carried the disagreement beyond what was happening on the ice. The two fathers now stood on opposing sides of a question involving safety, toughness, and what children should be expected to tolerate in the middle of a competition. Their conversation became heated. Witnesses heard the men arguing. Later, as the children changed out of their equipment near the locker rooms, the confrontation turned physical. Junta would testify that Costin attacked him and gave him what Junta's attorney later described as a serious thrashing. Afterward, Junta had a 4-inch scratch on his face, cuts on his arms, and scratches on his legs. He claims some of those injuries came from Costin kicking him with his skates. Other adults stepped between the men and brought the fight to an end. For a moment it appeared the danger had passed. Junta walked out of the arena. His son and the other children remained inside, still changing in the locker room. Junta had removed himself from the confrontation. The two men were separated, and there was no reason for them to face each other again. But several minutes later, Thomas Junta returned. Junta would later say that he came back only to collect Quinlan and the two children who had accompanied them. Nancy Blanchard, an employee at the arena, remembered his return differently. According to Blanchard, Junta appeared angry. She attempted to prevent him from re-entering the building, but she said he pushed her into a wall and continued toward Costin. A photograph showing bruises on her arm would later be presented to the jury. Junta denied pushing her. Moments later, the two fathers encountered each other again. Almost immediately, the fighting resumed. Who initiated the second confrontation would become one of the central questions at Thomas Junta's trial. Junta said Costin struck first, throwing what he described as a sucker punch, jumping on him and continuing to hit and kick after both men fell. Prosecution witnesses gave a different account. They said Junta grabbed Costin first. Regardless of how the second fight began, its final moments were witnessed by adults and children inside the arena. The difference in the men's size was considerable. Junta stood approximately 6 feet 1 inches tall and weighed about 270 pounds. Costin was approximately 6 feet tall and weighed between 156 and 160 pounds. During the struggle, Costin ended up on the floor. Junta was above him, straddling his body and striking him in the head, face, and elsewhere. The number of punches would later become one of the most contested issues in the case. Junta said he delivered only 3 off-balance blows. Several defense witnesses supported his account, including his son. According to Junta, the punches came quickly. He said he stopped when Costin raised his hand over his face. I didn't know what the guy was going to do, Junta later testified. It was crazy. 2 women who witnessed the fight described something far more prolonged. They said Junta pinned Costin on the floor and repeatedly struck him in the head. Nancy Blanchard describes many punches. She and another witness screamed for Junta to stop, saying, "You're going to kill him." For part of the attack, Costin was still moving. Witnesses saw him fighting, kicking, or flailing beneath Junta. Then the movement stopped. When bystanders finally pulled Junta away, Michael Costin laid motionless on the arena floor. Emergency personnel treated him at the scene before rushing him to the hospital. He never regained consciousness. Michael Costin died the following day. He was 40 years old. Junta said when he left the arena, he did not understand how seriously Costin had been injured. 5 days later, on July 10, 2000, Thomas Junta was formally charged with manslaughter and arraigned in court. A Middlesex County grand jury indicted him on August 10th. The argument had lasted only minutes. The criminal case and the national debate it ignited was only beginning. The case quickly attracted national attention. Television networks carried the trial. Talk radio programs debated it. To many observers, Michael Costin's death became a symbol of parental aggression and violence at youth sporting events. Thomas Junta was transformed into a national character, the so-called hockey dad. But the case presented to the jury was more complicated than the nickname suggested. Junta admitted striking Costin, but maintained that he had acted in self-defense. His attorneys portrayed him as a gentle giant who had tried to avoid a second confrontation and fought back only after Costin attacked him. Prosecutors argued that whatever threat Costin might initially have posed had ended by the time Junta pinned him to the floor and continued striking him. The medical evidence became essential on both sides. Experts for the prosecution and the defense agreed that Costin suffered a ruptured vertebral artery in his neck, but they disagreed sharply about the amount of force and the number of blows required to cause the fatal damage. Dr. Stanton Kessler, the medical examiner who performed the autopsy, testified for the prosecution. He documented 15 areas of trauma to Costin's body. The injuries included abrasions and bruises to his face, swelling around his left ear, a contusion over his right eyebrow, damage to his shoulder, wounds on his hands, and deep bruising on his back. The most serious injuries were inside Costin's head and neck. One vertebral artery had ruptured, interfering with the flow of blood to his brain. Ligaments near the base of his skull had also been badly torn. Dr. Kessler described the damage as evidence of substantial force. There was also a second separate injury inside Costin's brain. Small blood vessels had torn, causing serious internal bleeding. Dr. Kessler concluded that Costin died from blunt trauma to the head and neck, with bronchial or fluid in the lungs acting as a contributing factor. He acknowledged that the vertebral artery could potentially be ruptured by a single blow or relatively minor force, but he believed the complete pattern of Costin's injuries demonstrated that multiple blows had been inflicted. The defense presented its own expert, Dr. Ira Canfer. Dr. Canfer believed the ruptured artery was a rare injury that could have been caused by minimal force. In his opinion, a single blow could have produced the fatal rupture. The defense hoped that the interpretation would support Junta's claim that he had thrown only a few unbalanced punches without realizing they could endanger Costin's life. Under the prosecution's theory of involuntary manslaughter, it was not enough to establish that Junta had unlawfully struck Costin. The Commonwealth also had to prove that Junta knew or reasonably should have known that the battery endangered human life. If a single relatively minor blow had caused a rare unforeseeable injury, the defense could argue that Junta could not have anticipated Costin's death. But the prosecution had the eyewitnesses. No one, including Junta, claimed that only one blow had been delivered. Multiple witnesses testified that Costin remained active after he had already been punched at least twice. Others estimated that Junta struck him anywhere from 3 to 10 times or more. The jury had to decide whether Junta was lawfully defending himself or whether he had continued using force after any need for self-defense had passed. They also had to decide whether he knew or reasonably should have known that the beating endangered Costin's life. On Friday, January 11, 2002, the jury returned its verdict. Thomas Junta stood in the Cambridge courtroom as the jury forewoman began to read. He bowed his head, guilty of involuntary manslaughter. Junta said nothing and showed little visible reaction as officers led him away. Several of his brothers wept inside the courtroom. Juror Richard Rothberg, a sales executive and former youth soccer coach, later explained the decision. "I felt sorry for him. I really do," Rothberg said. "But I can't say he's not guilty. A man was killed. Someone has to be accountable for it." Outside the courthouse, Michael Costin's sister Mary Barbuzzi stood beside his 4 children. She described her brother as a loving sibling, a caring son, and, above all, a dedicated father. "Michael Costin succeeded in the hardest job there is," she said. "He was a good father. Our family will never be complete again." Middlesex County District Attorney Martha Coakley expressed hope that the case might prevent another death. "If any good could come from the tragedy," she said, "it would be ensuring that another parent did not end up on an autopsy table because of rage surrounding children's sports." But the verdict was accompanied by an extraordinary act of forgiveness and the revelation of another violent chapter in the Costin family's history. Earlier that day, Michael Costin's father, Gus Costin, approached Junta in a courthouse hallway. He placed a hand on Junta's shoulder and told him he was forgiven. Junta reportedly nodded and answered, "Thank you." Gus understood the consequences of a fatal family confrontation in a way few people could. In 1975, Gus Costin had been involved in a physical dispute with another of his sons, 17-year-old Dennis Costin. During the confrontation, Gus fatally stabbed the teenager. Gus said Dennis had charged at him. He was subsequently convicted of manslaughter and served time in prison. Decades later, Gus spoke about the bitter irony of losing 2 sons through violent altercations. Dennis in a confrontation involving Gus himself, and Michael after the fight with Thomas Junta. It added another painful dimension to the hockey dad case. Following Costin's death, Costin's sister and her husband assumed responsibility for caring for the 4 children. Michael Costin's death was not the first time violence had taken a son from the Costin family, and it would not be the family's final loss. Thomas Junta faced a statutory maximum sentence of 20 years. Because he was a first-time offender, early reports suggested he might receive 3 to 5 years. But during the sentencing hearing, the court heard directly from the family left behind. Michael Costin Jr., Michael Costin's eldest son, had only been 11 years old when he witnessed his father's fatal beating inside the Burbank Ice Arena. Standing before the court, the boy delivered an emotional victim impact statement and pleaded with the judge to punish Junta severely for what he had done. The judge ultimately sentenced Junta to between 6 and 10 years at MCI Cedar Junction. In explaining the sentence, the judge identified several aggravating circumstances. The crime occurred in the middle of the afternoon inside a public skating arena. Children and adults watched Junta repeatedly strike Costin. The confrontation continued long enough for witnesses to scream at him to stop. Most significantly, 3 of Michael Costin's sons witnessed the beating that resulted in their father's death. Junta's son Quinlan witnessed it as well. Quinlan had only been 10 years old when the fight occurred. When the case went to trial 2 years later, he testified in his father's defense, supporting Junta's claim that he had thrown only 3 punches. The children of both men would carry consequences of that afternoon long after the courtroom proceedings had ended. Junta sought a new trial, arguing that prosecutors had failed to disclose information involving Dr. Kessler, the Commonwealth's medical expert. An organ donation coordinator named Melissa Christie said she had attended a forensic conference where Dr. Kessler discussed vertebral artery injuries and referred to a famous Massachusetts hockey dad case. According to Christie, Dr. Kessler explained that such injuries could occur with relatively little force. She said his conference presentation did not attribute Costin's ruptured artery to substantial force or multiple blows. The defense argued that this information could have been used to challenge Dr. Kessler's trial testimony. The Massachusetts Appeals Court was not persuaded. The court found no meaningful contradiction. During the trial, Dr. Kessler had already acknowledged that a single blow could rupture a vertebral artery. His conclusion that Costin had been struck repeatedly had been based on a complete pattern of injuries, not merely the damaged artery. The pattern included torn ligaments, multiple areas of trauma, and separate bleeding inside the brain. The court also emphasized that the conviction did not depend entirely on expert testimony. Eyewitnesses described repeated punches. Costin remained active after the initial blows. Even Junta admitted striking him more than once. Junta also challenged the omission of the photograph showing bruises on Nancy Blanchard's arm. He argued that it was irrelevant and unfairly portrayed him as a person with a violent character. The appeals court disagreed, finding the photograph corroborated Blanchard's testimony and that the trial judge was entitled to admit it. Junta also claimed that the sentencing judge improperly considered an earlier allegation of domestic violence. The appeals court found no indication that the judge had punished Junta for that prior allegation. On September 23, 2004, the court affirmed both Junta's conviction and the denial of his request for a new trial. After serving roughly 8 years of his 6 to 10-year sentence for involuntary manslaughter, Thomas Junta was released from prison on August 27, 2010. The tragedy surrounding the hockey dad case did not end here. After the conviction, the appeals, or Thomas Junta's imprisonment and his ultimate release. In October of 2011, Junta's son Quinlan died at the age of 21. He was found dead in a Reading home, the same community where he, as a child, had witnessed the confrontation that changed both the Costin and Junta families forever. Months before his death, Quinlan had appeared in news reports after being charged in connection with an armed home invasion in Reading. Authorities did not publicly identify a specific cause of death, and no suspicious cause was announced at the time. Quinlan would remain connected in public record to the hockey dad case because he had been inside the arena that day and later testified for his father. But behind that association was a child who had watched a moment of adult rage reshape his family's life. 8 years after Quinlan's death, the Costin family suffered another unexpected loss. Michael Patrick Costin Jr., Michael Costin's eldest son, died suddenly on May 25, 2019. He was 30 years old, living in Lynn, Massachusetts. Michael Jr. had only been 11 years old when he witnessed his father's fatal beating. 2 years later, at Thomas Junta's sentence hearing, he stood before the court and described the pain left behind. As he grew older, Michael Jr. reportedly experienced serious legal struggles of his own, another difficult chapter in a family history already marked by violence, incarceration, in premature death. His family did not publicly disclose the specific cause of his sudden passing. And then on December 16th, 2020, Thomas Junta died at the age of 63, more than 20 years after the confrontation inside that Burbank Ice Arena. The fight inside the Burbank Ice Arena lasted only a few minutes. Its consequences followed two families for generations. Michael Costin entered the rink as a father watching his children play hockey. He never returned home. Thomas Junta arrived as a father concerned that a children's game had become too violent. Before the afternoon was over, his own violence had resulted in another father's death. And all around them were children. The case became known as the Hockey Dad murder, a label that transformed into a national debate about parental rage and violence in youth sports. But the complete story is not simply about a fight between two fathers. It's about a family that had already lost one son to a fatal confrontation before losing another. It's about children who witnessed something no child should ever have seen. It's about the death of Michael Costin and the wounds carried by the people who survived him. And it's about a few irreversible minutes inside a neighborhood ice arena that continue to echo through two families long after the crowds, cameras, and headlines had disappeared. Thank you for listening to Murders in Massachusetts. If this episode resonated with you, please consider sharing it, and be sure to follow or hit the like button so you always know when new episodes are released. Multi-part episodes will be released on a weekly basis, while standalone episodes will follow a bi-weekly release schedule. You can always find more information about this or any episode at murdersinma.com. If you have any insight into a case or a story you believe should be told, you can reach me directly at murdersinmapodcasts@gmail.com. And as always, remember the stories we tell here are about real people, real families, and communities that continue to carry them. I'm Jonathan Power. We'll see you next time.